Hey, and welcome, Gurus, to the section conclusion of the Azure Application Gateway section of this course. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company. And in this section conclusion, we're going to use a case study scenario to help us review the Application Gateway concepts covered in this section. We're going to also review the Application Gateway components and review the logic involved in picking a load balancing solution. So to get started with our Control-Alt-Suites organization, when we're talking about reviewing the Application Gateway concepts, what we're talking about here is understanding that Application Gateway is a Layer 7 load balancing solution that provides regional load balancing to different compute resources in its backend for one or multi-site web application hostings. And then when we're talking about reviewing those Application Gateway concepts, we're talking about the front end, be that internal or external, the backend targets, which are those compute resources, the routing rules that help us route traffic to the correct backend targets, the listeners that go into our routing rules that listen for that traffic and capture it and guide it to the appropriate routing rule, the HTTP settings, and the health probe that all tie into how we route traffic. And then when we're talking about reviewing the strategy by which we pick a load balancing solution, we're talking about thinking about at what layer are we going to be balancing and whether or not we want to use this to balance regionally or globally, and do we need to host multiple sites? So without further ado, let's take a look at that case study scenario. Here we have our Azure Application Gateway with a public IP front-end configuration. And whenever our client makes a request to this Application Gateway, it is captured by a listener that is listening for one or multiple sites in a multi-site hosting solution. And it's listening for these sites, also listening for a specific port, and it has a certificate configuration to determine how we will handle TLS encryption between the client and the Application Gateway. And that listener is also associated with a rule, and this is our routing rule. And this routing rule has our HTTP settings that also determines how we're going to configure that TLS encryption between the Application Gateway and those resources in our backend. Additionally, it is also where we have that custom probe configured to be able to check whether or not those resources in our backend are healthy and able to service our requests. Then, once we have all of those components tied into our routing rule, we route that traffic to those resources in our backend target, and we're able to send back that request to our client. So that's our case study scenario here. Let's use this case study scenario to review our Application Gateway concepts. For our Azure Application Gateway, we have to understand that it is a regional Layer 7 load balancing solution. So we create our Application Gateway, and whenever we do that, we're able to use it to balance traffic from clients to multiple types of resources in the back end. And these are our VMs, our VM scale sets, our app services, our IP addresses, and our fully qualified domain names. So we're able to balance between one or multiple sites that are hosted behind that Azure Application Gateway. Now, the components that make this all possible are that front-end configuration, be that public or private, those back-end targets that are actually servicing the traffic, the listener that is capturing that traffic and making sure that the traffic gets with the appropriate routing rule. And it's these rules that tie everything together: the listener, the HTTP settings, and the health probe. The HTTP settings are where we configure more encryption to determine how we will handle encryption between the Application Gateway and those resources in the back end. And when properly configured, we can enable either TLS termination or end-to-end encryption. And then that health probe checks to make sure those resources in the back end are healthy and ready to service our requests. So these are all the components of an Azure Application Gateway. Now let's review what we might be thinking about when picking a load balancing solution. Again, we have this Punnett square here where we're determining whether or not we want to use Layer 4 or Layer 7. Maybe if we were using Azure Load Balancer, we would use Layer 4. And if we were going to use Azure Load Balancer, we'd have the option between regional or global. But in our case, we wanted Layer 7 and we wanted regional, so Azure Application Gateway would be our solution. Again, this is how you think about setting up a load balancing solution. You think about at what layer are you load balancing? And then you think about whether or not you want to load balance regionally or globally when we're talking about a public cloud. All right, Gurus, That wraps up this section and all of the things that we wanted to review that we covered in this section. Thanks so much for joining me in this section, and I look forward to seeing you in the sections to come.